Thank you, Mel. Let's see if I can make you forget the heat. I was here 4 years ago, and at that time I talked about the book of Job with special emphasis on plaques and engravings for that book. And what I have to say tonight is a logical continuation of the previous subject. It's the same theme, basically, namely the theme of the ego's encounter with the self. You know, this is the one basic feature of Jungian psychology. The ego and how it relates to the reality of the self. Jungian psychology is the only psychological standpoint that operates out of an awareness that there are two centers in the psyche. Some other psychologies, some other analytic approaches have an awareness that there are two entities in the psyche. There is an unconscious, there is a second entity, but no other psychological standpoint operates out of the awareness that there are two centers. That's unique to Jungian psychology. And since there are two centers, if that comes into conscious realization, then those two centers must collide. They must have an encounter with each other. And that's what happens when the ego, which is the little center, has an encounter with the self, which is the big center. You know, all analysis is no more than a prelude to this experience, the encounter with the self. Here's how Jung put it in his 1925 seminar. He says this, quote, "Analysis should release an experience that grips us or falls upon us as from above, an experience that has substance and body, such as those things which occurred to the ancients. If I were going to symbolize it, I would choose the Annunciation." End quote. Now, it may very well happen that this crucial experience, although it's prepared for by analysis, does not take place during the period of regular analysis at all. It may very well take place many years after the termination of regular analysis. And in such a case, one is very grateful for his conscious knowledge of Jungian psychology. He's got a roadmap, so to speak, that helps him get his bearings when this experience falls on him from above. He can say with Job then that previously I'd heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees thee. That's what happens when this experience falls on one. It can also occur without benefit of any analysis at all. It can happen without any particular preoccupation with the unconscious. And for these reasons, this is why I consider it vitally important to talk about the self in public. Because one can never know when he is speaking to an individual who has had or is going to have the experience I'm talking about. And such an individual, now or later, may recall what has been spoken about and may find it immensely helpful in his time of need. I know that for a fact, but such things do happen. So we're going to be talking about the self tonight. But what is it? As I said, it's the second center of the psyche, the ego being the first. To say a little more about it, one could say that it's the objective center as opposed to the subjective center. It's the transpersonal center. And it's the center and connector with the totality that includes both conscious and unconscious. It's not a theory, it's a fact. One has to use words to describe facts, but I assure you what we're talking about is a fact that is verified by the experience of many people in and subsequent to analysis. But the self is exceedingly difficult to describe. This is because it's a transcendent entity that is larger than the ego. That means it cannot be grasped, it cannot be totally embraced by the ego, and therefore it cannot be defined. What can be defined has to be smaller than the ego doing the defining. It's contradictory and paradoxical so far as the ego's categories of understanding are concerned. And like the philosopher's stone of the alchemists, it has many different synonyms which express different facets of its complex reality. And one of those synonyms that Jung has proposed for the self is the greater personality. And that's the particular entity I'm going to be talking about tonight. He introduces this term, greater personality, in his essay concerning rebirth, which is in Collected Works, Volume 9-1. And in that place, he speaks of individuation, quote, as a long, drawn-out process of inner transformation and rebirth into another being. And concerning that other being, he writes, quote, this other being is the other person in ourselves, that larger and greater personality maturing within us. It's the inner friend of the soul. That's why we take comfort whenever we find the friend and companion depicted in a ritual. For example, the friendship between Mithras and the sun god. It's the representation of a friendship between two men, which is simply the outer reflection of an inner fact. It reveals our relationship to that inner friend of the soul into whom nature herself would like to change us. That other person who we also are and yet can never attain to completely. We are that pair of Dioscuri, one of whom is mortal and the other immortal, and who, though always together, can never be made completely one. The transformation process strives to approximate them to one another, but our consciousness is aware of resistances because the other person seems strange and uncanny, and because we cannot get accustomed to the idea that we are not absolute master in our own house. We should always prefer to be I and nothing else. But we are confronted with that inner friend or foe, and whether he is our friend or our foe depends on ourselves. That's where he first introduces the term greater personality. But in that same essay, he describes the ego's encounter with the greater personality in these very, very important words. This is especially important quotation in my opinion. Quote, when a summit of life is reached, when the bud unfolds and from the lesser, the greater emerges. Then, as Nietzsche says, one becomes two, and the greater figure, which one always was, but which remained invisible, appears to the lesser personality with the force of a revelation. He who is truly and hopelessly little will always drag the revelation of the greater down to the level of his littleness, and will never understand that the day of judgment for his littleness has dawned. But the man who is inwardly great will know that the long-expected friend of his soul, the immortal one, has now really come to lead captivity captive, that is, to seize hold of him by whom this immortal had always been confined and held prisoner, and to make his life flow into that greater life, dash, a moment of deadliest peril, end quote. This final phrase comes as a shock after hearing this beautiful description of the ego's encounter with the greater personality. We learn only at the very end that the encounter is dangerous, deadly dangerous. This danger refers to the wounding effect that the self has on the ego on first encounter. At the worst, the meeting of ego and self can set off an overt psychosis. Even at best, the ego's first decisive meeting with the self brings about a painful humiliation and a demoralizing sense of defeat. As Jung puts it in another place, the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. This experience of wound or defeat is part of what I have spoken of as the Job archetype. I use that term because the story of Job is a particularly apt example of the pattern. And chief features of this pattern are four. And this is going to be the subject of my talk tonight. I'm going to give you examples of this pattern. So get these four features. Number one, there is an encounter between the ego and the greater personality, represented as God, angel, or superior being of some kind. Number two, there's a wound or a suffering of the ego as a result of this encounter. Three, in spite of the pain, the ego perseveres and endures the ordeal and persists in scrutinizing the experience in search of its meaning. And four, as a consequence of that perseverance, there is a divine revelation by which the ego is rewarded with some insight into the transpersonal psyche. So to repeat the four, there's an encounter, there's a wounding, there's perseverance, and there's revelation. I'm going to talk about four examples of this theme. The examples vary. Each example emphasizes one particular aspect, and by taking them all together, you get a broader picture of the nature of the phenomenon. But each individual who has this experience has it uniquely, so that his experience will not be exactly Job's, it will not be exactly Jacob's, it will not be exactly Arjuna's, it will not be exactly the Apostle Paul's, and it will not be exactly Nietzsche's. But having familiarity with various examples of the species will help you to recognize it when you encounter it for yourself. I'm going to talk about 4 tonight, but there are more than that. Quite a list, I think, could be culled out of the cultural history of man. But just to give you a brief list, here's a few. Jacob and the angel of Yahweh, which I shall talk about. Arjuna's encounter with Krishna, which I shall talk about. Paul's encounter with Christ. Moses in the Koran's encounter with El-Khidr, the green one, which you can find in the 18th surah of the Koran. Faust's encounter with Mephistopheles in Goethe's Faust. Captain Ahab and encounter with Moby Dick, the whale, in Melville's work. Nietzsche's encounter with Zarathustra, which I shall talk about. And finally, the one closest to us of all, Jung's encounter with Philemon in his confrontation with the unconscious. But as I say, I shall confine myself to 4. Jacob, Arjuna, Paul, and Nietzsche. And in making this kind of overview, you must forgive the summary way in which I treat each example. It's really quite unfair to treat so briefly such profound episodes in the cultural history of the human race. But my justification for it is to give you a sense of the archetype. And I don't know any better way of doing that than to present you briefly with individual examples of the archetype. And that then can give you a sense of the underlying general symbolic image that operates within individual variations. So first, Jacob and the angel of Yahweh. This account is found in the 32nd chapter of Genesis. You will recall that that Jacob tricked his brother Esau out of his birthright, and then, conspiring with his mother Rebekah, he stole his father's blessing by fraud. Blessing belonging to belonging to Esau, the elder one. He then had to flee the country to escape his brother's vengeance. And many years later, having acquired 2 wives and considerable wealth, the time had come when he had to return to the land he had fled from. So he returned to his own country. But that return meant that he must now meet Esau, the brother he had wronged many years previously, and naturally he was afraid. We're always afraid of the person we have wronged. And on the night prior to the meeting with Esau, he met the angel of Yahweh at the ford of Jabbok, the river Jabbok. And the Jerusalem Bible gives the following account of this event. And there was one that wrestled with him until daybreak, who, seeing that he could not master him, struck him in the socket of his hip, and Jacob's hip was dislocated as he wrestled with him. He said, "Let me go, for day is breaking." But Jacob answered, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." He then asked, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he replied. He said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have been strong against God, you shall prevail against men." And he blessed him there. Jacob named the place Peniel, because I have seen God face to face, he said, and have survived. The sun rose as he left Peniel, limping because of his hip. See, this story contains all four of the features that I spoke of. There's an encounter with a superior being, there's a wounding, there's a perseverance, and there's a divine revelation. Divine revelation in this case is the blessing, first of all, and secondly, the investment with a new name. So a second identity. Jacob's collective identity is revealed because he now becomes the ancestor of Israel. And what's particularly interesting psychologically about this example is that it illustrates that an encounter with the greater personality may come at the same time as an encounter with the shadow. Jacob experienced the encounter with Esau very much as an encounter with God. Esau became a kind of stand-in for God for him. That's because Jacob's guilty conscience imbues Esau with divine power. The scripture specifically says, when Jacob meets Esau, he says to him, quote, "I have seen thy face as though I had seen the face of God." So that Esau and God overlap. See, this means psychologically that the shadow, which one is unrelated to, may activate the self. And if one has wronged the shadow, then what's activated is the self in its avenging aspect. Now, this motif can operate either internally or externally. If you don't understand this after I've explained it, please inquire during the question period, because I want to try to make this clear to everybody. In an outer external sense, if I commit a wrong against another person, I will fear that person's desire for revenge. I'll know that he's entitled to revenge because I wronged him. And that condition then constellates the self. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. The whole phenomenon of vengeance belongs to the transpersonal center of the psyche. It belongs to the self. And if an individual has been wronged in any serious way, it activates a defensive response from the self. And if one has set the self against you, you're at a sizable disadvantage. In a similar way, if I have wronged the shadow within, if I've violated the inner figure that constitutes my shadow in some serious way, it's a violation of totality, which again can arouse the vengeance of the self against the ego. And all sorts of things may happen then. I may cut myself on my electric saw, or I may have an accident with the car. Anything of that sort can happen if that constellation has been set up. Now, what Jacob is obliged to do in this situation is encounter the reaction that has been constellated endure it without succumbing either to defensive hostility or to despair. And if he succeeds, that would correspond to a successful wrestling with the angel. One way of thinking of it is that perhaps Jacob had to wrestle with his rage at Esau before he could arrive at a conciliatory attitude. You know, he did arrive at a conciliatory attitude. He sent Esau gifts, and it worked. But he could not do that until he had overcome his power reaction. And the power reaction could express itself either in rage against Esau for causing him trouble, or in cringing fear of Esau because he knew he had a legitimate complaint against him. Jung makes a very profound observation here. These things are scattered throughout his works. This is especially important. It can be found in paragraph 524 of volume 5. He says this, quote, "The God appears at first in hostile form, as an assailant with whom the hero has to wrestle. This is in keeping with the violence of all unconscious dynamism. In this manner, the God manifests himself, and in this form he must be overcome. The struggle has its parallel in Jacob's wrestling with the angel at the ford Jabbok. The onslaught of instinct then becomes an experience of divinity." I've underscored that, and I'm not sure whether that's my underscoring or Jung's. It doesn't matter. I'll repeat it. If you really get this, you've got the main thing. The onslaught of instinct becomes an experience of divinity, comma, provided that man does not succumb to it and follow it blindly, but defends his humanity against the animal nature of the divine power. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. End quote. What he's saying there is that intense affects are manifestations of the greater personality. One should never take personal responsibility for an intense affect. One doesn't crank up something like that. It falls out of heaven, or it roars up from the depths. It's a manifestation of the self, any intense affect, the onslaught of instinct. And if one can relate to it without understanding, then it becomes an experience of divinity. And this is what was achieved by Jacob's wrestling with the angel. Another aspect of such an encounter is mentioned in this remark of Jung's. This comes from Memories. He says, quote, "A contemporary Jacob would find himself willy-nilly in possession of a secret that could not be discussed and would become a deviant from the collectivity." End quote. This corresponds to the fact that an encounter with the greater personality is necessarily a secret. One can't talk about it. Can't talk about it in its particulars anyway. It's a secret that both creates the individual as something separate from the collective, and at the same time it's a wound that painfully separates and alienates him from the collective. So it has both a positive and a negative aspect. A striking example of this phenomenon is the figure in Greek myth, Philoctetes. Philoctetes inherited the bow and arrow of Heracles. Heracles was the greater personality. And Philoctetes was an ordinary person like all the rest of us. And he couldn't handle these weapons, and he injured himself on one of the poisoned arrows of Heracles that he inherited, and it became an incurable wound. And the stench was so horrible, nobody could stand to be around him. So he was abandoned on an island. And yet the time came when an oracle said that the Trojan War could not be won by the Greeks unless they got the help of Philoctetes. So they had to go back and apologize for ostracizing him and lure him back into the collectivity. It's a beautiful example of a certain aspect of the phenomenon, what happens. One's alienated and becomes an objectionable stink to the collective, and yet he's needed by the collective. All right, I turn now to another example. Arjuna and Krishna. This is a magnificent example of an encounter with the greater personality that's recorded in the Bhagavad Gita. Like the book of Job, its central feature is a dialogue between a grief-stricken man and a personification of deity. Now, I have no scholarly knowledge concerning the Gita. I know it's obviously a composite document that grew into its present form by a series of accretions. But I think, just considering it psychologically, that it's not at all impossible that it might have originated, just as I think Job did, in one individual's actual experience of the greater personality. However that may be, in its present form, it's certainly one of the world's finest examples of this experience. The story begins with the despair of Prince Arjuna before a battle. A battle he does not want to fight, because it's a battle against his kinsman. And as he expresses his anguish, the god Krishna replies to him through the figure of his chariot driver. Let me give you just a few brief tastes of this event, with apologies to Robert Johnson, who is expert on this subject. First, Arjuna speaks. O Krishna, seeing these my kinsmen gathered here desirous to fight, my limbs fail me, my mouth is parched, my body shivers, my hair stands on end, my bow slips from my hand, my skin is burning. O Krishna, I'm not able to stand upright, my mind is in a whirl and I see adverse omens. Neither do I see any good in slaying my own people in this strife. I desire neither victory nor kingdom nor pleasures. I do not wish to kill these warriors, even though I am killed by them. Krishna replies, Thou hast been mourning for those who should not be mourned for. These bodies are perishable. The truly wise mourn not either for the dead or for the living. The dwellers in these bodies are eternal, indestructible, and impenetrable. Therefore fight, O descendant of Bharata. He who considers this self as a slayer, or he who thinks that this self is slain, neither of these knows the truth. For it does not slay, nor is it slain. This self is never born, nor does it die, nor after once having been, does it go into non-being. This self is unborn, eternal, changeless, ancient. It's never destroyed, even when the body is destroyed. Therefore, Arjuna, be resolved to fight. Regarding alike pleasure and pain, gain and loss, victory and defeat, fight thou the battle, thus sin will not stain thee. Now, characteristically, the greater personality has presented an attitude that is too large for the ego to understand. Arjuna is confused because what he's presented with is an attitude beyond the opposites. And in this case, the motif of wounding is represented by his confusion. You see, the wounding is not so prominent in this Eastern story as it is in the Western story of Job. And that, I think, says something about the difference between the Eastern and the Western psyche. Anyhow, Arjuna replies, O Krishna, if to thy mind the path of wisdom is superior to the path of action, then why art thou engaging me in this terrible action? By these seemingly conflicting words thou art bewildering my understanding. See, that's the wounding. Therefore tell me with certainty that by one of these, by following them, I can attain the highest. And then Krishna proceeds with what can only be called a very patient explanation. I imagine him beginning with a sigh. In this world, twofold is the path already described by me. The path of wisdom is for the meditative, and the path of work is for the active. Man does not attain to freedom from action by non-performance of action, nor does he attain to perfection merely by giving up action. He who, restraining the organs of action, sits holding thoughts of sense objects in his mind, that self-deluded one is called a hypocrite. But, O Arjuna, he who, controlling the senses of the mind, follows without attachment the path of action with his organs of action, he is esteemed. Do thou therefore perform right and obligatory actions, for action is superior to inaction. This world is bound by actions except when they are performed for the sake of religious worship. Therefore, O son of Kunti, do thou perform action without attachment. This is then followed by a magnificent, lengthy description of the religious way of life. And particularly noteworthy is Krishna's description of his own nature. Now, I remind you, from the psychological standpoint, what we're listening to is the self describing its nature to the ego. So this is not just a story of a remote event. It's an account of an experience that can befall any one of us. And here's how Krishna describes himself, in part, terribly abbreviated. I am the origin and the dissolution of the universe. That's the line that flashed into Robert Oppenheimer's mind when he witnessed the first atomic explosion. The origin and dissolution of the universe. There is naught else existing higher than I. Like pearls on a thread, all this universe is strung in me. I am the taste in waters and the radiance in sun and moon. I am the sacred syllable, Om, in all the Vedas. Sound in the ether, self-consciousness in mankind. I'm the sacred fragrance in earth and brilliance in fire. I'm the life in all beings and austerity in ascetics. Know me as the eternal seed of all beings, the intellect of the intelligent and the prowess of the powerful. O Arjuna, I know the past, present, and future of all beings, but no one knows me. Now, I would remind you that what's being expressed here is the nature of the self, what the individual psyche can encounter. This is the way it talks about itself. This is its phenomenology. That the self, which has as its only available manifestation of consciousness, an individual incarnation. So each individual self, to the extent that it comes into visibility, talks like that. So he has some similarity, the way Krishna describes himself to Arjuna, has some similarity to the way Yahweh speaks to Job out of the whirlwind. But it is quite different too. See, the whole style is different. It's much calmer, much more objective. There's no whirlwind here. One might say it's more civilized. It's more psychological. The West is a barbarian psychologically in comparison to the East. But what Krishna does then is to explain patiently to Arjuna, in this calm, objective way, the difference between the ego and the self, thereby acquainting him with the nature of the greater personality. And this revelation happened because, like Job, Arjuna persevered in questioning Krishna. Another example. Paul and Christ. Here again, we return to the scriptures of another world religion. The relevant texts are found chiefly in the book of Acts, and I'm going to read you a compilation of the essential accounts. I think it's better to hear it firsthand rather than have it summarized. This is Paul speaking. I once thought it was my duty to use every means to oppose the name of Jesus the Nazarene. This I did in Jerusalem. I myself threw many of the saints into prison, acting on authority from the chief priests. And when they were sentenced to death, I cast my vote against them. I often went round the synagogues, inflicting penalties, trying in this way to force them to renounce their faith. My fury against them was so extreme, I even pursued them into foreign cities. On one such expedition, I was going to Damascus, armed with full powers and a commission from the chief priests. And at midday, as I was on my way, I saw a light, brighter than the sun, come down from heaven. It shone brilliantly round me and my fellow travelers. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Hebrew, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you, kicking like this against the goad." Then I said, "Who are you, Lord?" And the Lord replied, "I am Jesus, and you are persecuting me. But get up and stand on your feet, for I have appeared to you for this reason, to appoint you as my servant and as witness of this vision in which you have seen me, and of others in which I shall appear to you. Get up now and go into the city, and you will be told what you have to do." The men traveling with Saul stood there speechless, for though they heard the voice, they could see no one. Saul got up from the ground, but even with his eyes wide open, he could see nothing at all, and they had to lead him into Damascus by the hand. For 3 days he was without sight and took neither food nor drink. Paul was initially absolutely shattered by his encounter with the greater personality. He was blind for 3 days, and according to certain traditions and other accounts, there's reason to believe that he had to retreat and recuperate for 3 years in Arabia. I think that's very likely. The biblical account doesn't say that exactly, but there are traditions that imply that. I think it's very likely indeed. Paul's encounter with the greater personality, he identified with Christ, you see. And that's the origin of the Christian church, as we know it anyway. So, may be violently resisted by the conscious ego, as witness the persecution of the Christians that Saul engaged in before his vision. And this is a psychological phenomenon that is well documented. We can see it happen, not so infrequently. And certainly in Paul's case, it's very understandable in view of the fact that the awareness that was brought to him by his encounter with the greater personality imposed very rigorous requirements on his life. You see, in the case of Paul, he was obliged to sacrifice his personal life totally. He had no personal life after his encounter with the greater personality. He was turned into a slave of Christ. He begins his letters to the Romans and to the Philippians by calling himself Paul, the slave of Jesus Christ. He begins his letter to Philemon with the words, "From Paul, a prisoner of Christ Jesus." And that's what he was, literally. Paul's experience has given us some of the clearest statements that we possess as to how it feels to have had a major encounter with the greater personality. The state of being captive to the greater one is summed up very well in the 2nd chapter of Galatians, where Paul says, "I have been crucified with Christ, and I live now, not with my own life, but with the life of Christ who lives in me." Jung made a statement that is not too far from that same meaning in his memories. After his encounter with the unconscious and with the personification of the greater personality, which was called Philemon, he says this, quote, "It was then that I ceased to belong to myself alone, ceased to have the right to do so. From then on, my life belonged to the generality. It was then that I dedicated myself to the service of the psyche." The Jung's service of the psyche is analogous to Paul's service of Christ. There are two different terms for the same phenomenon, actually, that are appropriate to the context of their different cultural and collective psychic backgrounds. All right, there's one more. I'm now going to make a leap of 2,000 years into modern times and talk about Nietzsche. Nietzsche and Zarathustra. Preceding Jung's example, this is the outstanding modern example of an encounter with the greater personality, which led to a literary production. We don't know how many encounters, anonymous encounters of this nature there may have been, but if the individual was never able to integrate it sufficiently to give it formulation and transmit it to a larger view, the experience dies unseen, you see. But Nietzsche was able to do that. Jung makes the remark that it's only the tragedies of Goethe's Faust and Nietzsche's Zarathustra which mark the first glimmerings of a breakthrough of total experience in our Western Hemisphere. What he means by Western Hemisphere is Western civilization. And the term breakthrough of total experience will be synonymous with encounter with the greater personality. So he's telling us that only Goethe's Faust and Nietzsche's Zarathustra bear witness in modern times to this encounter with the larger center of the psyche. And Nietzsche's Zarathustra is vastly more important, in my opinion, psychologically, because the author lived it totally. Goethe did not. Goethe remained in a certain Olympian stance above the experience that was described in Faust. Nietzsche lived out his experience totally to the bitter end. And so it's the first real encounter of a modern ego with a greater personality that left a record of the experience. He perished in that encounter. But how could it have been otherwise, since he was the first to tread this unknown region, and of course would be ignorant of its dangers? You can't know about the dangers until they've compassed you about, until they already got you. I think we owe an immense debt to Nietzsche. Jung learned from his experience. He learned a tremendous amount. I'm convinced that without Nietzsche's examples, Jung might very likely have been a fatality. In his memoirs, Jung writes about discovering Nietzsche in 1898. Here's what he said. I was curious and finally resolved to read him. Thoughts Out of Season was the first volume that fell into my hands. I was carried away by enthusiasm and soon afterward read Thus Spake Zarathustra. This, like Goethe's Faust, was a tremendous experience for me. Zarathustra was Nietzsche's Faust, his number two personality, he means. And my number two now corresponded to Zarathustra. And Zarathustra, there could be no doubt about that, was morbid. Was my number two also morbid? This possibility filled me with a terror, which for a long time I refused to admit. But the idea cropped up again and again at inopportune moments, throwing me into a cold sweat, so that in the end I was forced to reflect on myself. Nietzsche had discovered his number two only late in life, when he was already past middle age, whereas I had known mine ever since boyhood. Nietzsche had spoken naively and incautiously about this Areton, this secret, this thing not to be named, as though it were quite in order. But I had noticed in time that this only leads to trouble. That, I thought, was his morbid misunderstanding, that he fearlessly and unsuspectingly let his number two loose upon a world that knew and understood nothing about such things. He was moved by the childish hope of finding people who would be able to share his ecstasies and could grasp his transvaluation of all values. He did not understand himself when he fell headfirst into the unutterable mystery and wanted to sing its praises to the dull, God-forsaken masses. That was the reason for the bombastic language, the piling up of metaphors, the hymn-like raptures, all a vain attempt to catch the ear of a world which had sold its soul for a mass of disconnected facts. And he fell, tightrope walker that he proclaimed himself to be, in the depths far beyond himself. Now, actually, we have data that demonstrates that Nietzsche encountered the greater personality for the first time in early adolescence. Evidently, Jung was not familiar with this source. Not very many people are. After Nietzsche had his breakdown in 1889, he was hospitalized in a mental hospital and was considered insane for the rest of his life, for the next 11 years. He was unable to express himself in any kind of coherent way. However, his internal psychological function was much more intact than his outer appearance would have indicated. He wrote a manuscript while in the mental hospital and smuggled it out with a patient who was leaving. He got to get past the watchful eyes of his sister, who would have destroyed it. And this is a highly dramatic and significant event. He succeeded in smuggling it out, and it was eventually published. And it's available in translation, but nobody knows about it. And the reason is that the Nietzsche scholars are involved in a conspiracy of silence against it, because what he talks about are the psychological facts of his life, and those facts the Nietzsche philosophers imagine belittle Nietzsche the philosopher. What they do is they enlarge Nietzsche the human being. This work has been published under the title of My Sister and I. A very unfortunate title, but the title wasn't chosen by Nietzsche. It was chosen by his publishers to capitalize on the most scandalous aspect of this work, which talks about the incestuous relations between Nietzsche and his sister since childhood. So needless to say, that did have to be smuggled past the sister. Anyway, it's a marvelous psychological document because Nietzsche has realizations. He has in his experience of total defeat, which apparent insanity, of course, would be for a person of such vast intellectual brilliance. He is fulfilled as a human being, and this is all communicated in this work. Someday, someone is going to do a full psychological case history of Nietzsche, and this will. He'll then take his place as the first step psychologist. Anyway, this is all preface to a quote I'm going to make from this work. Here's what he tells us. Of all the books in the Bible, he says, 1 Samuel, especially in the opening passages, made the profoundest impression on me. In a way, it may be responsible for an important spiritual element in my life. It is where the Lord 3 times wakes the infant prophet in his sleep, and Samuel 3 times mistakes the heavenly voice for the voice of Eli, asleep near him in the temple. Convinced after the 3rd time that his prodigy is being called to higher services than those available to him in the house of sacrifices, Eli proceeds to instruct him in the ways of prophecy. I had no Eli, says Nietzsche, not even a Schopenhauer, when a similar visitation darkened the opening days of my adolescence. I was all of 12 when the Lord broke in on me in all his glory, a glaring fusion of the portraits of Abraham, Moses, and the young Jesus in our family Bible. In his 2nd visitation, he came to me not physically, but in a shudder of consciousness, in which good and evil both clamored before the gates of my soul for equal mastery. The 3rd time he seized me in front of my house in the grasp of a terrible wind. I recognized the agency of a divine force because it was in that moment that I conceived of the Trinity as God the Father, God the Son, and God the devil. We're talking about an adolescent here, you see. So this indicates, end quote, this indicates that Nietzsche's prophetic function was born at the age of 12. And these particular revelations, with their emphasis on the conflict of the opposites, indicate that the self, in its modern phenomenology, the way we are acquainted with it, had been constellated in him. so that the core issue for him became the polarity between Christ and Antichrist. When you read his works carefully, you can see that to be the basic underlying issue. Consciously, Nietzsche sided with Antichrist. He deliberately identified himself with Antichrist. But unconsciously, he identified with Christ. So that after his breakdown, he signed some of his letters, the crucified one. But either way, you see, he lived his life out of a profound religious attitude. The way Jung puts it is that the tragedy of Zarathustra is that because his God died, Nietzsche himself became a god. And this happened because he was no atheist. He was of too positive a nature to tolerate the urban neurosis of atheism. It seems dangerous for such a man to assert that God is dead. He instantly becomes the victim of inflation. Nietzsche was very important to Jung. If you need any further evidence of that, surely the fact that he conducted a lengthy seminar on Zarathustra over a period of 5 years, the notes of which are accumulated in 10 volumes, that ought to suffice to demonstrate the fact that he was seriously concerned with Nietzsche. I want to read you just a couple of small excerpts from those notes from the Zarathustra seminar. Quote, he was born in 1844, and he began to write Zarathustra in 1883, so he was 39 years old then. The way in which he wrote it is most remarkable. He himself made a verse about it. He said, Das wurde ein zu zwei und Zarathustra ging an mir vorbei, which means, then one became two and Zarathustra passed by me. That means that Zarathustra then became manifest as a second personality in himself. That would show that he had himself a pretty clear notion that he was not identical with Zarathustra. But how could he help assuming such an identity in those days when there was no psychology? Nobody would then have dared to take the idea of a personification seriously, or even of an independent, autonomous spiritual agency. 1883 was the time of the blooming of materialistic philosophy, so he had to identify with Zarathustra in spite of the fact that he felt, as this verse proves, a definite difference between himself and the old wise man. Then his idea that Zarathustra had to come back to mend the faults of his former invention is psychologically most characteristic. He had an absolutely historical feeling about it, and it filled him with a particular sense of destiny. Of course, such feeling is most uplifting, and it was the Dionysian experience par excellence, and in the latter part, these Dionysian ecstasies come in. In one of his letters to his sister, he gives the most impressive description of the ecstasis in which he wrote Zarathustra. He says about this way of writing that it simply poured out of him. It was almost an autonomous production. With unfailing certainty, the words presented themselves, and the whole description gives us the impression of the quite extraordinary condition in which he must have been, a condition of possession. It was as if he was possessed by a creative genius that took his brain and produced this work out of absolute necessity. I want to give you an example. This will do it much better than any talk can do about the kind of ecstasis that Nietzsche could fall into. He describes it in this following passage from his book, Ecce Homo. This is Nietzsche speaking. Has anyone at the end of the 19th century a clear idea of what poets of strong ages have called inspiration? If not, I will describe it. If one had the slightest residue of superstition left in one's system, one could hardly reject altogether the idea that one is merely incarnation, merely mouthpiece, merely a medium of overpowering forces. The concept of revelation, in the sense that suddenly, with indescribable certainty and subtlety, something becomes visible, audible, something that shakes one to the last depths and throws one down, that merely describes the facts. One hears, one does not seek, one accepts, one does not ask, who gives? Like lightning, a thought flashes up with necessity, without hesitation regarding its form. I never had a choice. A rapture whose tremendous tension occasionally discharges itself in a flood of tears. Now the pace quickens involuntarily, now it becomes slow. One is altogether beside oneself with the distinct consciousness of subtle shudders and of one's skin creeping down to one's toes. A depth of happiness in which even what is most painful and gloomy does not seem something opposite, but rather conditioned. Everything happens involuntarily in the highest degree, in a gale of feeling of freedom, of absoluteness of power, of divinity. The involuntariness of image and metaphor is strangest of all. One no longer has any notion of what is an image or a metaphor. Everything offers itself as the nearest, most obvious, simplest expression. Here all things come caressingly to your discourse and flatter you, for they want to ride on your back. On every metaphor you ride to every truth. Here the words and word shrines of all being open up before you. Here all being wishes to become word, all becoming wishes to learn from you how to speak. Well, he's describing the experience of the unconscious in its creative rush of meaningful image. And very few people can describe it so well because he had such superb powers of expression. See, most of Thus Spake Zarathustra was written in this ecstatic state of mind. It poured directly out of the unconscious. And in this book, the greater personality is the figure of Zarathustra, the reincarnation of the ancient prophet. And this figure announces a new morality and a whole new worldview. And what he announces in truth is the harbinger of depth psychology. Zarathustra is an absolutely remarkable psychological document. The way it describes the collective shadow of modern man is breathtaking. It abounds in brilliant psychological truths. But it's also a dangerous poison. It can make you sick. I cannot read very much of Zarathustra. It makes me ill, literally. It's because its transcendent insights have not been assimilated by the whole man, and therefore they haven't been humanized. And that makes them evil and destructive, and they can kill. But that's the nature of the greater personality. See, that's part of what it is. That's why we talk about wounding. It doesn't exist within the categories of the ego, of human decency. It bursts those categories on both sides, on the good side and the evil side. But as a phenomenon, it's absolutely remarkable. Many of the ideas that we are familiar with from Jungian psychology show up in Nietzsche. For instance, I'm going to read you a short section, which is an explicit description of the self. See if you don't agree this sounds familiar. This comes from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Part 1, Section 4. I, you say, and are proud of the word, but greater is that in which you do not wish to have faith, your body and its great reason. That does not say I, that does I. What the sense feels, what the spirit knows, never has its end in itself, but sense and spirit would persuade you that they are the end of all things. That is how vain they are. Instruments and toys are sense and spirit. Behind them still lies the self. The self also seeks with the eyes of the senses. It also listens with the ears of the spirit. Always the self listens and seeks. It compares, overpowers, conquers, destroys. It controls, and it is in control of the ego too. Behind your thoughts and feelings, my brother, there stands a mighty ruler, an unknown sage whose name is self. In your body he dwells. He is your body. There is more reason in your body than in your best wisdom. And who knows why your body needs precisely your best wisdom. Your self laughs at your ego and at its bold leaps. What are these leaps and flights of thought to me, it says to itself. A detour to my end. I am the leading strings of the ego and the prompter of its concepts. The self says to the ego, feel pain here. Then the ego suffers and thinks how it might suffer no more. And that is why it is made to think. The ego says to the ego, the self says to the ego, feel pleasure here. Then the ego is pleased and thinks how it might often be pleased again. And that is why it is made to think. You see, end of quote. Nietzsche as an intuitive type. Intuitive and how. As the self associated with the inferior function, namely sensation, which is represented by the body. So the self is the body to him. That's generally true of intuitives. If you look around your friends who are particularly interested in body work, they're almost all intuitives. We sensation types don't have to pay that much attention to the body. We don't have to deify it. But the remarkable point in this account is the explicit description of the self as a second center of the personality and as a center that's superordinate to the ego. And Nietzsche knows that about the self only because he's had the experience. It wasn't all assimilated at the time he wrote it, but he had the experience. It did get assimilated in the mental hospital. That's the great worth of the posthumous document that demonstrates that. I want to put in a few words of homage to Nietzsche. I see him as a martyr in the cause of emerging depth psychology. If one reads him carefully, one gets definite hints that he deliberately chose the way of inflation in order to learn what lies on the other side. He was a man of immense psychological courage, immense psychological rashness, more than courage, but courage too. Although he was pushed over the brink of psychosis by syphilitic brain disease, in some sense, he also seemed to choose it. Here's what he says in his posthumous autobiography. Quote, "The legend makers saw Empedocles plunging into the belching flames of Etna. But this fate was reserved not for the great pre-Socratic, but for me alone. Having been separated from the love of my life, Lou Salome, the love that made me human, I made my desperate plunge into the fires of madness, hoping like Zarathustra to snatch faith in myself by going out of my mind and entering a higher region of sanity, the sanity of the raving lunatic, the normal madness of the damned." And in the same posthumous work, Nietzsche writes these moving words from his room in the madhouse. "Is my honor lost because women have betrayed me to weakness, or I have betrayed my own strength, seeking the power of true knowledge, which alone can save us from approaching doom? Am I completely damned because I am crushed beneath the Athenian dead on the plain of Marathon? Let Demosthenes, the eloquent defender of Athenian honor, deliver his funeral oration over me. No, you have not failed, Friedrich Nietzsche. There are noble defeats as there are noble deaths, and you have died nobly. No, you have not failed. I swear it by the dead on the plain of Marathon." End quote. I think now, with this final work of Nietzsche's available to us, we can see his life in its entirety as a heroic tragedy, a sacrifice which inaugurated the age of depth psychology and which first brought greater personality to the awareness of modern man. And after Nietzsche's experience, the way was now prepared for Jung. So, in conclusion, you will have noticed, and it's surely significant, that 3 of the 4 cases I have discussed are to be found in the scriptures of 3 major world religions. And there was a 4th example that was not discussed, that story of Moses and El Khidr, which is found in the Holy Book of Islam. What this indicates is that the experience of the greater personality is of such numinosity that it may sometimes bring into being a whole new religion. But now, for the first time, in what I would call the Jungian era, we are in a position to begin to understand scientifically and generally these psychological entities that generate religions. This influx of new knowledge is pouring into the modern psyche. Of course, it pours into individuals first of all, but it's also pouring into the modern psyche as a collective entity. And this influx prevents both a great opportunity and a great danger. It's as if collectively we are about to encounter the greater personality, which, as Jung says, can make our life flow into that greater life, but which is also a moment of deadliest peril. It seems to me that our best chance to be spared a collective catastrophe resides in the possibility that enough people will have individual conscious encounters with the greater personality and thereby will contribute to the process of immunizing the body social against a mass atheistic inflation. If each individual can work towards that end by diligently assimilating his projections and seeking his own unique individual encounter, then he will contribute to that immunizing process. To the extent that it can take place in the arena of the individual psyche, it will not have to take place in that dreadful arena of the collective psyche. In the words of Jung, with which I will close, he says this in paragraph 512 of Mysterium Communicationis. One must celebrate a last supper with oneself, and eat his own flesh and drink his own blood, which means that he must recognize and accept the other in himself. Is this perhaps the meaning of Christ's teaching that each must bear his own cross? For if you have to endure yourself, how will you be able to rend others also? Thank you. We can have a brief question and comment period, either right away or after a break. How many want a break? How many don't? Well, that'll have to be decided by fiat. We'll have a break. I've already had the same question asked 3 times, so I better address myself to it.
Very effective stuff here.
One person formulated it this way, but the 2 others asked the identical question. There are no women on your list. Is that because their documents do not exist? How or would it be different for a woman the encounter with a greater personality? Well, I haven't thought this through very much, but several women immediately come to mind, so I'll mention them as examples. In Greek myth, of course, there are a number of examples of the feminine encounter with deity. An outstanding example is Semele, the mother of Dionysus. Danae, the mother of Perseus, is another example. Mary's encounter with the angel of the Annunciation is another example. I haven't thought this through carefully, so I don't want to state it too explicitly. It's something we can all reflect on, but it's my impression that when the woman has when the feminine entity has the encounter with the greater personality, it has somewhat different quality to it. We don't hear about wrestling. Sometimes we hear about fleeing, but we don't hear about wrestling. Certainly, wounding may be a part of it when the feminine entity is the operative one. An outstanding example, of course, is Semele, who through her own insistence but also she was goaded by Hera into it, so that complicates matters. It's not exactly the fault of the ego. If an archetypal entity goads her into a stupid action, but nonetheless, Semele insisted on Zeus's appearing to her in his full glory, and then she was consumed by the fire that the lightning created. Now, in the mythological material, whether it is a woman figure, a feminine figure, or a masculine figure who encounters the greater personality, I don't think should be too rigorously translated into the experience of women and men specifically. You must remember that each individual has a masculine and feminine component. These are one of the basic pairs of opposites. And to the extent that one is dealing with authentic individuation, symbolism, then the question of is it a man or is it a woman recedes in importance, because one's dealing with the opposites and one is holding both the opposites. Now, we're living in a time when women are realizing their need to realize adequately their feminine reality, their feminine dimension, and they're therefore seeking models and images and myths that speak to feminine experience, and that's all understandable and appropriate. But strictly speaking, that does not refer to the actual individuation process. That refers to a prelude to the individuation process, you see. But certainly there are examples of feminine figures having that encounter, and there's a lot more. And of course, Psyche, the Arjuna and Psyche story, is a splendid example too. Not to mention Hades and Persephone.
Talking this evening about the self, I had the impression that you were saying that sort of tentative Jungian psychology, that there isn't a personal self. It sounded like it was very sort of impersonal, transpersonal self, that I even wondered if this is shared by everyone, or whether there really is a personal self that goes through an individuation process.
Question is the self personal or is it impersonal? Such questions are not answered theoretically. They're answered experientially on the basis of what the accumulated data indicates. And the accumulated data indicates that it's both. It's personal and it's transpersonal. And under different circumstances, one or the other aspect might predominate. In cases where the ego is very much in need of succor, sustenance, the personal aspect of the self may manifest itself with special prominence. One sees that phenomenon, for instance, at the birth of Christianity. The image of the Christian God that emerged was a loving, personal God. That's not the whole picture of the psychological entity, but it's one part of it. So that what emerges from the unconscious tends to some extent compensate the conscious situation, and what tends to be evoked is what's needed or what's being neglected. Yes, sir?
I'm curious, you said the ego is, per se, the little center, and the self is the big center. I I'm curious, in terms of the use of the word Jungian, wouldn't Jungian refer to the ego or the little self of Carl Jung, the man? That, per se, if we're ascribing a greater or a higher glory to the self, why don't we call ourselves Philomanians or some such thing? The ego self of Carl Jung, the man, doesn't strike me that we should concentrate on that, but perhaps you could shed some light on that?
No, no light.
A little heat, not too much light.
I'll let that stand as a comment. I
Okay.
won't
Okay.
say anything about it. Yes.
You said something at the end that seemed very important to me, and I would like to understand it more deeply. When you spoke about the immunization of the social body through the full individuation of more individuals.
Mhm.
And I would like you to be more specific on this process and on the balance between the two and what kind of inflation you're referring to.
If I had a blackboard, I'd try to illustrate what I mean. What I would do, I would draw on the blackboard a great circle. And then at the circumference of that circle, I would draw a lot of little tiny circles, each of which is intersected by the circumference of the great circle. Some of the little circles are more below the line, and some are more above the line, indicating various degrees of consciousness. I would use that image to try to visualize for you how I perceive the nature of the collective psyche. The collective psyche is made up of the sum total of individual human psyches. And we are all, therefore, all of us as individuals are connected by virtue of our lower psychic depths with the collective psyche and with each other individual in that collective psyche. We are all part of the larger organism. That can be demonstrated. It's not very difficult. You need to only have somebody rush into this room under the influence of some intense affect, and we'll all have it. It'll spread like wildfire. We'll all have it. We may not all act on it, but we'll all have it. We'll all feel it. It demonstrates the fact that we're all cells of this one great organism. And we're affected not just by things we're conscious of, but we're affected by things we aren't conscious of, too. And so it sometimes happens that what somebody's experiencing on the other side of the planet connects with us and shows up in our dream, for instance. So this is what the nature of the collective psyche is. Now, once that is perceived, that's a matter of perception, being able to see it. As I described it to you, this probably sounds just like a theory. But if you have a body of experience, it's not a theory anymore, it's a fact, because you have enough data to establish it. And once that's recognized as a fact, then it's evident that the way one, if one hopes to do anything at all to alter the great collective organism, he has to do it by cultivating that part of the collective organism that is available to him. And that part is his own psyche. Not somebody else's psyche, it's his own psyche that's available to him. And as you cultivate that little plot of land that is your own, you are influencing, at least infinitesimally, the state of the great collective organism.
That's called casting the beam out of your own eye.
All right? Mm-hmm. called, or the Last Supper, I mean, eating your own flesh, drinking your own blood. Mm-hmm. Yes.
If the self is God, and also,
I beg your pardon? Speak up, please.
yeah, if the self is God, okay, and also the whole universe and all the galaxies and everything, how do you think life and we, I mean, the ego, has any importance for the self, or that's just the self any importance for the ego? I mean, if you would blow up, if mankind would blow himself up, would it make any big change to the self?
Yeah, what's the importance of the ego? The importance of the ego is that the ego is the carrier of consciousness. And to the extent that consciousness is valuable in a cosmic sense, and it is supremely valuable, it it requires an ego to manifest within, to be the vessel to carry it. Mm-hmm.
Jung faced the greater self and remained sane, but Nietzsche faced the greater self and went insane.
Nietzsche went insane. Yes, he did.
Do you have any idea why Nietzsche went insane and you didn't?
Yes, I do have an idea. You want me to tell it?
Will you tell me
They both had the experience of the encounter with the greater personality, with the overwhelming archetypal psyche. Jung integrated his experience, and Nietzsche, during his working life, didn't. As I suggested, he did integrate it, in my opinion, in his final silent last years. But so far as his known work is concerned, during that period, it was not integrated, and Jung did integrate it. And what does it mean to integrate it? It means to have achieved a sizable enough ego, referring to the gentleman's other question, that it doesn't drown. The way you can tell it's drowned is when one lives and functions and speaks in a non-human way. When he's lost his limited human dimensions, and we all have a good instinct to tell us when we're encountering that sort of thing. You don't have to learn it with your head. An instinct tells you there's something smells bad. When Jung read Nietzsche, he knew right away it's morbid. And if you're in good connection with your instinct, when you read Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and you feel sick, you'll know there's something wrong. Of course, if you're not in good touch with your instinct, then you won't. But we've got built in the equipment to tell us what's good for us and what's poisonous. But the difference is the development of the ego that's able to have the experience and relate to it without identifying with it. And then, if one succeeds in that, then one becomes an initiated one. One has been, becomes a privileged participant in a level of wisdom of the psyche that isn't generally available, but one doesn't go around spouting out that fact. You see, because the preaching about it is just an expression of the identification. Mm-hmm.
Do you think that the ego is, when somebody does cocaine or alcohol or drugs, is actually it's starving for attention so it can activate the self, and that it's desperately looking for spiritual awakening?
Mm-hmm.
So people that are doing cocaine or alcoholics or whatever, they might have this genetic predisposition, vulnerability, and in effect it's been carried on in their family collectively, and that what they're trying to do is trying to kind of like, the ego is starving for so much attention that it's willing to kind of like sabotage itself to the self in order for it to kind of like reaffirm the fact that it's not alone.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, that it's a concrete misapplication of the hunger for connection with the autonomous psyche. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Earlier you mentioned something about, I can't remember the term you used, but somehow harming the shadow and the violation of the shadow.
Mm-hmm.
Could you give an example of that?
Well, we talked about Nietzsche. Somebody asked me a question, but then she didn't bring it up. I'll bring it up. It's relevant here. Somebody brought up that particular event in Nietzsche's life that Jung alludes to somewhere, where he had the image of a toad. Is that the one you're thinking of?
Yes, it was a frog on his hand.
On his hand, an ugly toad or frog in his hand that he was obliged to eat. And you get a variation of that same image in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where a snake crawled into the mouth of a shepherd. Jung's thought about that was that it was probably an image of his syphilis that needed to be assimilated. My notion is that it was probably an image of his incest experience that needed to be assimilated. But there's a lot of talk in Thus Spoke Zarathustra about what Nietzsche calls the ugliest man. In Zarathustra, the ugliest man is rejected. He isn't accepted. So that Nietzsche is an excellent example of concerning the very question you asked. Because he did not, at least in his working life, this was all corrected, I want to repeat, in his years in the asylum. That's what makes this final document so important. It redeems him psychologically. It damns him philosophically, so the philosophers will have nothing to do with it, but it redeems him psychologically. But so far as his working life was concerned, he did not assimilate the shadow. He committed a crime against the shadow. He was inflated, horribly inflated. Read such things as ecce homo, and you're shocked. And therefore, the vengeance of the self had a destructive effect. So that's the first example that comes to me on that question. Mm-hmm.
Were there other examples that you mentioned also finally assimilated the experience.
You mean Jacob? Jacob?
St. Paul and.
Yes, they were assimilated. Yes, they were. See, Nietzsche is the modern example. He's the first man. I think of Nietzsche and Jung as something like Saul and David. Saul was the first king of the Hebrew kingdom, and he was a failure. He was rejected by God, and the Spirit of God was taken away from him. And David was given, and he couldn't do anything wrong. He was. That's an archetype, that Saul-David conjunction. And the Nietzsche-Jung combination I see as somewhat analogous. I think it's time to stop. So, thank you.